I'm always impressed with how whiskey distilleries come up with their marketing techniques and how the best whiskeys in the world are usually tied in with some great stories. Now, one story I really did not know much about was the story of Colonel E.H Taylor Jr. and the OCF Distillery. Now, of course, Colonel E.H Taylor Jr.'s small batch whiskey is pretty well known and you can find it all over the US. But who was he and what made him so interesting? Grab a glass, let's talk about it. Colonel E.H Taylor Jr. is quite an amazing person, and I have to say it's almost a shame that I did not know more about him until recently. In fact, I only kind of picked up on his story and dug a little bit deeper after reading this book, Buffalo Barrels and Bourbon, The Story of Buffalo Trace. And as you might know, Colonel E.H Taylor Jr., we're just going to call him E.H for E.H Jr. for short, was kind of a very key part of this story. And so was his OCF Distillery. I mean, kind of being the first step in the journey of what is now Buffalo Trace. As you could imagine, like anybody who would have colonel or have such a title before their name was either in the military or they did some very amazing things. And actually, E.H. Jr. is on the latter. He did some pretty amazing things in the whiskey world, some of which really stood out to me. Now, you can't be in whiskey without having opened up a distillery. If you have a whiskey named after you, you're probably assuming this already happens. But you might not know his distillery. I recently actually saw a YouTube video about OFC and I thought it was amazing because I was making this at the same time. But OFC is a very interesting distillery. Of course, it was in Kentucky, as you would imagine, but there were some things that made it very unique. For starters, it's kind of interesting that nobody really knows what OFC stands for. Some people thought it was old-fashioned copper or old-fired copper, but no one's really sure. And it's kind of interesting that although the whiskey you can still find these days and the story is really rich, nobody really knows what it was named after. My guess is on fired. And that's also the guess in the book, but I think they make some good points that kind of seem to make a little bit more sense than old-fashioned. Now, the old in the name, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. We are talking quite a few years ago where old was like in every whiskey ever produced. You had the Old Crow line, Old Forester, old. All of it was old, all of it was great. And many of these brands are still around today, even so with the old in their name. What makes them really stand out is copper. Now, again, we might have this idea in our heads that distilleries have been using copper for their stills forever, but that's not actually the case, at least not in the Americas. Maybe in Scotland, fine, and moonshiners, probably because that was a very easy metal to kind of mold and make your own makeshift stills out of. But in large industrial uses, copper was not very common. And at OFC Distillery, E.J. Jr. was very specific about wanting to use copper vessels for fermentation, not plastic like down here, but copper, and his copper stills. Now, he didn't just come up with this on his own. He was very lucky and able to travel Europe and see this trend and hear what European distillers were doing and the ideas behind why they were using so much copper. So he brought that over to the States. Now, the OFC distillery being kind of made in 1870 or running around the 1870s, they were one of the first to introduce copper stills. And at that time, very few people were actually using copper. Now, was it important and did he make people aware of it? You betcha he did. In fact, it was so important to him that for a long time, OFC's slogan was, "We're the only distillery where from the moment the grain is processed, that grain is touching only copper from the very beginning to the very end until it gets put into a wooden barrel." Now, that's a very bold claim for that time and era, and it really makes you think, dude, the guy had some great marketing talent and was very interesting in how he started to bring awareness of the processes of distilling into their marketing at a day and age where a lot of marketed whiskeys might not have even been whiskeys. Now, he didn't just stop there. Another thing he did is something that, I only see this in a handful of distilleries these days, and usually it's the very high-end distilleries, but he actually introduced steam piping into his maturation warehouses so that he could temperature control the whiskey in the barrels. We're talking about the 1870s here. This isn't like a couple years ago. This guy was really thinking out of the box. Now, as you can imagine, thinking out of the box has a price tag associated with it, and it was something in the ballpark of around $60,000 that he invested, again, in the mid to late 1800s, which was a lot of money. Now, as his marketing claims and his marketing became even better and better and more people were being drawn to it, others took notice. Other people which were making, let's say, the not most authentic of whiskeys caught on and were starting to do the same, market their whiskeys as being delicious and produced in such a great way or whatnot. And this wasn't true. And this really irritated E.H. Jr. so much so that he spent 4 years fighting to get the Bottled and Bond Act put into place. Now, this act, of course, had multiple benefits for him. A, he could produce a lot of whiskey and not pay taxes on it until they were ready to sell. But what's really funny is he spent 4 years of his life fighting for the Bottled and Bond Act, and to have a bottled and bond whiskey has to be matured for 4 years. Now, the whole point of this act was to give consumers the idea that they were buying a product which is true to its namesake, being whiskey and being bourbon. Because at that time, you could take your whiskey, maybe it wasn't colored right way, it didn't taste like whiskey, you could just add whatever you wanted into it, and there wasn't really anybody around that's going to check and make sure that this is actually whiskey or actually bourbon. So the Bottled and Bond Act went a long way in protecting and giving whiskey the definition that it has today. And we owe that to E.H. Jr. Now, there's a lot more that he did in the decades that he was running OFC and involved in the whiskey game. And as the distillery changed and went on to new ownership, very interesting times for E.H. But he stayed very true to whiskey, opened up different distilleries, and continued to be an advocate and a spokesperson for whiskey. So I think it is actually very fitting that he does have a whiskey named after him. And I think it's a whiskey and a person that we should look a little bit more into as we look to the future of whiskey and kind of strive to make it even better. With that in mind, cheers to you, your next glass of whiskey. Maybe it's E.H. Jr., maybe it's OFC, or maybe it's Buffalo Trace.